The Hollow House expanded. Whispering Pines was a place where time seemed to move slower, a town built on traditions and quiet lives. Rows of pristine lawns and manicured hedges lined its streets, and neighbors knew each other's names, their lives intertwined through bake sales, Sunday services, and 4th of July parades. Amid this picturesque tranquility stood the Parker residence, a Victorian relic whose looming presence seemed almost out of place among the modest ranch-style homes around it. Nathan and Emily Parker, along with their 6 children, had lived there for over a decade. Despite the grandeur of their home, the Parkers were known for their seclusion. The children were homeschooled, and sightings of them were rare. Occasionally, Emily would venture into town for groceries, her interactions polite but brisk. Nathan, on the other hand, was almost never seen. His absence was explained away as work-related, though no one could quite say what he did for a living. To outsiders, the family seemed perfectly ordinary, if a bit eccentric. But to those who paid closer attention, there was an unsettling air about the Parkers, a subtle oddness that was hard to pinpoint. Sometimes, neighbors would hear strange noises late at night, muffled cries, or what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Lights in the attic flickered on and off at odd hours, though the family insisted it was just faulty wiring. Yet, no one ever voiced their unease. It wasn't the kind of town where people pried into each other's business. Until the night of June 18, 2023, when the illusion of normalcy was shattered by a single, haunting phone call. The call. At precisely 11:47 p.m., the Broken Arrow County 911 dispatch received a call. 911. What's your emergency? The voice on the other end was barely audible, a whisper that cracked with fear. Help us, it said. The operator strained to hear. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? What's happening? They're in the house, the voice said, trembling. They're going to kill us. Please, hurry. The call was cut off before the operator could get more details. Frantically, they traced the call to the Parker residence and dispatched officers to the scene. The House of Silence. When officers Grant and Ramirez arrived, the Parker house loomed like a dark sentinel against the moonlit sky. Its ornate features, the gabled roof, intricate trim, and tall windows, looked almost sinister in the shadows. The driveway was empty, and the house itself was dark, save for a faint, flickering glow emanating from the second floor. The officers knocked on the front door, their raps echoing in the still night. There was no answer. Police, Ramirez called out. If anyone's inside, make yourself known. Still, nothing. Grant tried the doorknob. It turned easily, the door creaking open to reveal an entryway cloaked in darkness. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The officers moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. The living room was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Signs of struggle. The once beautiful room was now a scene of chaos. The coffee table lay shattered, its glass top reduced to glinting shards scattered across the rug. A family portrait that had hung over the fireplace was askew, the glass in its frame cracked. But what caught the officer's attention was the trail of blood. It began at the base of the stairs and smeared across the polished hardwood floor, leading toward the back of the house. Jesus, Ramirez muttered, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Stay close, Grant said, his voice low. They followed the trail into the dining room, where it abruptly stopped. The long oak table was set with 8 plates, each one holding what appeared to be raw meat. At the center of the table sat an ornate candlestick, its waxy surface streaked with crimson. Is that? Ramirez began, but she couldn't bring herself to finish the question. Grant didn't answer. His attention was drawn to the faint sound of something creaking above them. The upstairs horror. Ascending the staircase, the officers found more signs of struggle. Scratches marred the banister, and droplets of blood dotted the steps. At the top, they paused, their flashlights illuminating a long hallway lined with closed doors. The faint glow they'd seen from outside was coming from the second room on the left. The door was ajar, and the flickering light spilled out onto the hallway floor. Grant pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun, revealing what appeared to be a child's bedroom. A small lamp on the nightstand blinked on and off, casting intermittent shadows across the room. The bed was unmade, its blankets tangled and stained. On the far wall, something had been scrawled in large, jagged letters. "They are here." "Who's here?" Ramirez whispered, almost to herself. A noise behind them made them both spin around. A soft, rhythmic tapping. The search continues. The sound led them back downstairs, where it seemed to emanate from the basement. The door to the basement was slightly open, and the tapping grew louder as they approached. "I don't like this," Ramirez said, her voice taut with tension. "Stay behind me," Grant ordered, descending the narrow stairs. The basement was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth. Their flashlights revealed a space cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and, disturbingly, several large jars filled with unidentifiable substances. At the far end of the room, the tapping stopped. In its place came a low guttural growl. "What the hell?" Grant began, but his words were cut short as the growl turned into a blood-curdling scream. The sound came from a door they hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a stack of crates. The door shuddered violently, as if something, or someone, was trying to break through. "Call for backup," Grant said, his voice tight with urgency. Ramirez fumbled for her radio, but before she could speak, the door burst open. Blood-stained walls expanded. The Parker basement was a dark, suffocating tomb. Officer Grant and Ramirez stood frozen as the hidden door swung open, its rusted hinges groaning like a dying thing. Their flashlights illuminated a yawning darkness beyond. The low growl that had rattled the door moments ago had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to amplify their every breath. "What's in there?" Ramirez whispered, gripping her flashlight tighter. Grant took a cautious step forward. The beam of his flashlight swept over the threshold, revealing a room that was both bizarre and grotesque. The walls were painted with smeared handprints, some small, like those of a child, and others unnervingly large, their fingers elongated and claw-like. The smudged prints created an unsettling collage of crimson chaos. In the center of the room, a crude circle was drawn on the floor in what appeared to be dried blood. Surrounding it were strange symbols etched into the concrete, intricate patterns that looked too deliberate to be random, but too alien to make sense. The altar of shadows. "What the hell is this?" Ramirez murmured as her eyes fell on the altar at the room's center. The altar was a crude construct of wood and stone, its surface adorned with objects that defied explanation. A bundle of feathers bound with human hair, a jar of milky liquid with something organic floating inside, and a tattered piece of fabric soaked in dried blood. But it was the photograph pinned to the altar that made Grant's stomach turn. It was a picture of the Parker family, Nathan, Emily, and their 6 children, all smiling brightly against the backdrop of their home. Someone had scratched out the eyes of every person in the photo except Clara, the eldest daughter. This is a ritual," Ramirez said, her voice trembling, "or something pretending to be one." Grant nodded, his gaze fixed on the scratched-out faces. "Why leave her untouched?" he muttered. "Why Clara?" Before Ramirez could respond, the faint sound of a child crying echoed through the room. The child's voice. "Did you hear that?" Ramirez whispered, her eyes darting toward the far corner of the room. The crying grew louder, punctuated by soft whimpers and gasps. It sounded unmistakably like a young child. "Hello," Grant called out, his voice firm but gentle. "We're the police. If you're hurt, we're here to help." The crying stopped abruptly. Grant and Ramirez exchanged a glance, then moved toward the corner. As they approached, their flashlights illuminated an old wooden wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar. Grant reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he pulled the door open, revealing nothing. The wardrobe was empty, save for a pile of moth-eaten blankets on the bottom shelf. "Impossible," Ramirez whispered, backing away. "I swear I heard." A sudden crash upstairs cut her off. The upstairs chaos. The officers raced back up the stairs, their adrenaline spiking. The crash had come from the living room, where they'd first entered. What they found stopped them in their tracks. The family's dining chairs, which had been neatly arranged around the table when they'd arrived, were now piled haphazardly in the center of the room. The chandelier overhead swayed gently, its glass ornaments tinkling like wind chimes. But it was the writing on the walls that froze them. In jagged, frantic letters, someone, or something, had scrawled the words, "They see you. Run." Ramirez's breath hitched. "This wasn't here when we came in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't," Grant confirmed, scanning the room for any sign of movement. "But someone." His words were drowned out by a blood-curdling scream from upstairs. The master bedroom. The scream led them to the master bedroom, its double doors flung wide open. The room was in disarray, dresser drawers pulled out, clothes strewn across the floor. On the bed lay a single object, a doll, its porcelain face cracked and its dress stained with something dark. But it was the figure standing in the corner that caught their attention. A young girl, Clara Parker, stood with her back to them, her long hair tangled and her pale arms hanging limply at her sides. "Clara," Ramirez called out softly. The girl didn't respond. "Clara, it's okay," Grant said, stepping closer. "We're here to help." As he reached out to touch her shoulder, Clara turned suddenly, her face twisted in terror. "They're here," she screamed. "They're in the walls." The house awakens. Before Grant could respond, a loud banging reverberated through the house. It came from every direction. Walls, floors, ceilings, like dozens of fists pounding in unison. The lights flickered violently, casting the room in a strobe-like glow. "We need to get out of here," Ramirez shouted, grabbing Clara's hand. As they moved toward the hallway, the pounding intensified. The walls seemed to shudder, cracks forming in the plaster. From the corner of his eye, Grant saw something move, a shadow darting along the edges of the room, too fast to be human. "Go! Go!" he yelled, pushing Ramirez and Clara ahead of him. The trio raced down the stairs, the sounds of the house growing louder and more chaotic. When they reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. It stuck. Ramirez yelled, pulling futilely at the handle. Grant turned, his gun drawn. The shadows were moving again, swirling like smoke along the walls and ceiling. And then, for the first time, they saw it. The unseen revealed. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its skeletal frame, and its mouth was a gaping void filled with rows of jagged teeth. The creature let out a guttural growl, its head tilting unnaturally as it regarded them. "Run!" Clara screamed, her voice breaking. With a final burst of strength, Grant and Ramirez forced the door open, and the three of them stumbled into the cool night air. Behind them, the Parker house seemed to exhale, the banging subsiding as the shadows retreated. The front door slammed shut on its own, leaving the house in eerie silence once more. The aftermath. Outside, the officers tried to catch their breath. Clara clung to Ramirez, sobbing uncontrollably. Grant looked back at the house, his mind racing. What had they just seen? What had the Parkers unleashed within their walls? The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. Backup had arrived. But as the other officers approached, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that the Parker house wasn't finished with them. Not yet. The entity's grasp. The air outside the Parker house was cold and oppressive, carrying an unnatural stillness that seemed to seep into the bones. The arrival of reinforcements. A mix of patrol officers, detectives, and paramedics did little to dispel the sense of dread that clung to the scene. Detective Keller stepped out of his unmarked car, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had been briefed over the radio on his way over, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Officer Ramirez cradling Clara Parker in a thermal blanket. The girl's hollow, tear-streaked face told him more than any report could. "What happened in there?" Keller asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Grant shook his head, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." Grant hesitated, his gaze drifting back to the house. Its once inviting facade now seemed to leer at them, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. "There's something in there, detective," he finally said. "Something wrong." The silent witness. Clara hadn't spoken since they brought her outside. She clung to Ramirez with a desperate grip, her eyes darting around as if expecting the shadows themselves to attack. "Clara," Keller said gently, kneeling in front of her. "Can you tell me what happened? Who's in the house?" Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. "It's okay," he reassured her. "You're safe now." Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It's not over." "What's not over?" Keller pressed. Clara's wide, terrified eyes met his. "They don't stop. They never stop." Re-entering the house, despite the ominous warnings, Keller decided to lead a second team into the house. He couldn't ignore what Grant and Ramirez had reported, or what Clara had implied. But Keller was a pragmatist, a man of logic. He needed evidence, something tangible to explain the horrors described by his officers. The reinforcements entered cautiously, their flashlights piercing the oppressive gloom. The house was eerily quiet, the chaos described by Grant and Ramirez now seemingly absent. The dining room was the first anomaly. The chairs, which Grant swore had been piled in the center of the room, were now back in their proper places around the table. The writing on the walls, "THEYCU," or in, was gone, the wallpaper pristine. "It's like nothing ever happened," one of the officers muttered. But Keller's attention was drawn to the faint sounds coming from the basement. A rhythmic tapping, like the ticking of an unseen clock, echoed faintly through the floorboards. "We'll split up," Keller ordered. "Grant, Ramirez, check the upstairs again. I'll take a team down to the basement." The basement's secrets. Keller descended the basement stairs, his flashlight illuminating the narrow, damp space. The strange symbols and the bloody circle described by Grant were still there, but now they seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. "Get this on record," Keller instructed one of the officers, who began filming the scene. The tapping grew louder as they approached the hidden room. Keller braced himself, pushing open the door to reveal the ritual space. Something new had been added. In the center of the circle, a pile of objects sat atop the crude altar, a teddy bear, a pair of small shoes, and a child's drawing. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. It depicted the Parker family standing outside their home. Above them loomed a shadowy figure with glowing yellow eyes. "Sir, you need to see this," an officer said, pointing to the walls. The handprints had multiplied. They now covered every inch of the room, and as Keller watched, fresh prints seemed to appear on the surface, as if an invisible hand was pressing against the walls. "Back upstairs," Keller ordered, his voice tight. Now, upstairs revelation. Grant and Ramirez had found the master bedroom undisturbed, but the child's bedrooms told a different story. Each room seemed to hold fragments of the children's lives, favorite toys, half-finished school assignments, but something was missing. "The beds," Ramirez said, her voice shaky. Grant frowned. "What about them?" "They're cold. Like no one slept in them for weeks." Their investigation was interrupted by a noise from the hallway, a soft, melodic humming. It was a lullaby, one that sent chills racing down their spines. They stepped into the hallway, guns drawn, to find Clara standing at the far end. She wasn't alone. The first apparition. Beside Clara stood a shadowy figure, its shape indistinct, but undeniably humanoid. Its hand rested on her shoulder, its fingers long and spindly. "Clara," Ramirez called out, but the girl didn't respond. The figure turned its head toward them, its face obscured by darkness, save for two faintly glowing eyes. It tilted its head as if regarding them with curiosity. Grant fired a warning shot into the ceiling, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it slowly raised one finger and pointed toward the attic door. And then it vanished, taking Clara with it. The attic awakens. The team regrouped in the living room, their nerves frayed. Keller took one look at Grant and Ramirez's shaken faces and knew they'd encountered something they couldn't explain. "What happened?" he demanded. "She's gone," Ramirez choked out. "That thing took her." Keller didn't waste time. "We're going to the attic." The pull-down stairs creaked ominously as they climbed, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was massive, its exposed beams creating a skeletal framework overhead. Dust motes floated in the beams of their flashlights, but at the center of the space, something shimmered faintly. It was a doorway, not a physical one, but a swirling mass of black and crimson energy, pulsating like a heartbeat. "What the hell is that?" one officer whispered. Keller stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to stop. Through the doorway, he could see glimpses of another world, a barren, twisted landscape shrouded in perpetual darkness. And standing in the distance, silhouetted against the crimson sky, was the same figure from the hallway. It held Clara in its arms, her small form limp and lifeless. The figure turned its glowing eyes toward them, and Keller felt an overwhelming wave of dread. The warning. Before anyone could react, the doorway began to collapse, the swirling energy pulling inward like water down a drain. "We need to get out of here," Keller yelled. The team barely made it down the attic stairs before the house itself seemed to groan, its walls trembling as if in protest. As they stumbled out the front door, the house fell silent once more. But Clara's final words echoed in Keller's mind. "They don't stop. They never stop." The Forgotten Covenant. The Parker house loomed in the moonlight, its once welcoming facade now a grim monument to something far older and darker than the family that had lived there. Officer Grant, Detective Keller, and Ramirez stood in silence on the cracked driveway, their breaths forming small clouds in the chilly air. Clara's disappearance had left a pall of despair hanging over them, but the attic's unearthly doorway, an inexplicable phenomenon that defied logic, was the true specter haunting their thoughts. "What the hell was that?" Grant finally asked, his voice breaking the uneasy quiet. Ramirez shook her head, still clutching the rosary she'd pulled from her pocket during the attic ordeal. "Something we shouldn't have seen. Something we shouldn't have gone near." Keller, ever the pragmatist, was already formulating a plan. "We're not leaving it at that," he said firmly. "That thing, whatever it is, has Clara. We need answers, and we're not getting them standing around here." Researching the house's history, back at the precinct, Keller and his team dove into the Parker house's history. At first glance, it seemed mundane. A large suburban home built in the early 1970s passed through several owners before the Parkers purchased it. But the deeper they looked, the darker the picture became. The house had changed hands unusually often. Families who moved in rarely stayed longer than a year, and the reasons for their departures were always vague. Financial troubles, health issues, or the ever-ambiguous personal reasons. Then came the disappearances. Starting in 1981, there were 3 unsolved cases of missing children, all last seen near the Parker property. Each case shared eerily similar details. The children vanished without a trace, and the families reported strange phenomena in their homes shortly before the disappearances, objects moving on their own, whispers in the dark, and shadowy figures glimpsed in the corners of their vision. "Why wasn't this flagged before?" Grant asked, scanning the reports. "It's scattered," Keller replied. "Different jurisdictions, different times. No one connected the dots." Ramirez frowned, pulling a yellowed newspaper clipping from the file. What about this? The original owners, Harold and Miriam Fulton. They were accused of something. Rituals. Keller leaned over her shoulder to read the article. It detailed accusations made by neighbors, who claimed the Fultons held strange gatherings in the basement and frequently dug up parts of their yard in the dead of night. No charges were ever filed, but the couple left the house abruptly in 1979, leaving behind a basement full of strange symbols carved into the walls. Symbols identical to those Grant and Ramirez had found. The town historian. Keller decided they needed an expert. That evening, he arranged a meeting with Martha Hensley, a retired librarian and local historian known for her encyclopedic knowledge of Broken Arrow's past. Hensley greeted them in her cramped but meticulously organized study. She was a petite woman in her late 70s, her sharp eyes belying her age. "I've been waiting for someone to ask about that house," she said without preamble. "Waiting?" Keller asked, surprised. Hensley nodded. "You're not the first to come looking for answers. Every couple of decades, someone comes to me about that cursed place, always after something terrible happens. What do you know about it?" Hensley leaned back in her chair, her expression somber. "The house sits on land that used to belong to the Cherokee Nation. According to local lore, it was a sacred site, one they avoided after a group of settlers desecrated it in the early 1800s. The settlers didn't last long. There were reports of strange illnesses, disappearances, and even mass hysteria. They abandoned the area, and it was left untouched for decades." "So, what's beneath the house?" Ramirez asked. Hensley hesitated before answering. "It's said to be a portal, a doorway to something ancient and malevolent. The Cherokee believed it was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where things that don't belong here could slip through. The Forgotten Covenant." Hensley pulled an old, leather-bound journal from her shelf and opened it to a page filled with faded handwriting and crude sketches. "This is from one of the settlers, a man named Jacob Price," she explained. "He claimed his group struck a deal with whatever dwelled there. They would offer sacrifices, small animals at first, then humans. In return, they'd be granted power, wealth, and protection." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but Price wrote something else. Hensley continued. "He said the entity they bargained with wasn't bound by their agreement. It took what it wanted, when it wanted, and the settlers were powerless to stop it. That's why they fled." Keller's jaw tightened. "And now it's targeting the Parkers." Hensley nodded. "The rituals the Fultons conducted were likely attempts to contain it, to appease it. But whatever the Parkers did, or didn't do, may have broken that balance. A desperate plan. Armed with this knowledge, Keller and his team formulated a plan to re-enter the house and confront whatever was inside. They consulted with local experts in folklore and paranormal studies, who suggested a ritual of banishment based on Cherokee traditions. The ritual required a combination of sacred items, blessed water, cedar branches, and a protective circle made of ash. It would be dangerous, they were warned. If the entity was as powerful as the legend suggested, it would not go quietly. The return. 2 nights later, under the cover of darkness, Keller, Grant, Ramirez, and a small team of volunteers entered the house. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was alive and aware of their presence. They moved quickly, setting up the protective circle in the living room, while Ramirez sprinkled the blessed water along the walls. The tapping noises returned, louder this time, accompanied by the faint sound of children laughing, a high-pitched, echoing chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Stay focused," Keller ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. As they began the ritual, the house erupted into chaos. Doors slammed, the walls shook, and the shadowy figure from before materialized in the center of the room, its glowing eyes fixed on them. The final confrontation. The entity's form shifted constantly, flickering between human-like and monstrous. It lunged at the team, but the protective circle held, its ash boundary glowing faintly with each attack. Keller recited the banishment incantation, his voice rising above the cacophony. The entity howled, a guttural, otherworldly sound that made the floor vibrate. From the shadows, Clara appeared, her eyes wide with fear. She reached out toward Keller. "Don't break the circle," Ramirez shouted as Keller hesitated. The entity seized its opportunity, striking at the weakest point in their defenses.